So it gives me great pleasure to introduce such a distinguished speaker on and in his field of expertise, the legacy of Antonio Gramsci to our understanding of cultural and political formation. Peter.
Thanks, Paul, for a very generous introduction. The last book mentioned is a book of interviews, by the way. So, I'd like to inaugurate this series of talks on the work of Antonio Gramsci on the in the year marking the 70th anniversary of his death. The anniversary will be on the 27th of April. There's going to be a conference in Rome organized by the Istituto Gramsci, and I'm meant to speak at that conference, and I actually plan to work on the final section of this paper, developing it into a full-blown paper that deals with what is known as the Southern Question. Most of you have a copy of the paper, and you can follow, since we're being recorded. So, political and cultural formation in the work of Antonio Gramsci. In his scattered and often cryptic writings, appearing as political pamphlets, journalistic pieces, cultural reviews, letters from prison, and most particularly, those notes from the same prison that were intended as the foundation for a comprehensive work for ewig, forever, for eternity actually, Antonio Gramsci provides elements for a large, all-embracing educational strategy. I'm using education in the broadest sense possible. I'll explain this. I'm not just talking about schooling or institutional education. I'm talking about consciousness in its broadest context. The strategy is intended to engender an intellectual and moral reform of a scale that, in his view, would render it the most radical reform since primitive Christianity. Educational programs targeting adults featured prominently in this all-embracing educational strategy. To appreciate the importance of the education of adults in this context, because I'm talking about cultural formation, political and cultural formation, but mainly with adults, one should highlight some key features of Gramsci's social theory. I'm going into basics here, because I'm not assuming everybody is familiar with Gramsci. Some of you are very well versed, of course, but others, are being introduced to the subject. So first of all, I'm going to state the obvious, the relationship between Gramsci and Marx. Well, Gramsci, let's make no bones about it, was a Marxist. He was one of the founders of the Italian Communist Party. So some of the writings by Marx, those to which he could have gained access, much less than we have access to today, were obviously very influential, as was also the work of Benedetto Croce and Giovanni Gentile. In fact, Italian philosophy has been locked in, philosophy experts can bear me out on this, some of them in the room, in idealist philosophy. You have to keep this in mind. Gramsci's works are embedded in a Marxian conception of ideology, based on the assumption that the ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. The dominant material relationships grasped as ideas, hence of the relationships which make one class the ruling one, therefore the ideas of its dominance. That's an English translation of Marx and Engels from the German ideology. Not only does the ruling class produce the ruling ideas in view of its control over the means of intellectual production, but the dominated classes produce ideas that do not necessarily serve their interests. These classes that, quote, lack the means of mental production and are immersed in production relations which they do not control, tend to reproduce ideas that express the dominant material relationships. And I'm actually quoting Jorge Larraín. After all, as Marx and Engels had underlined, each new class which puts itself in place of the one ruling before it is compelled, merely in order to carry through its aim, to represent its interest as the common interest of all the members of society, that is expressed in ideal form. It has to give its ideas the form of universality, and represent them as the only rational, universally valid ones. Now, you would have thought that this is Gramsci writing this, because this is central to his theory of hegemony. In actual fact, this is actually taken from a text that Gramsci could not have actually read at his time, because it was not published, and that's the German ideology. A funny anecdote, as an aside, I once gave a presentation on Gramsci in Germany at the University of Frankfurt to sociology and political theory students, and I was in the embarrassing position of having to quote the German ideology in English to Germans. Anyway, right. So, which brings us to the concept of hegemony, because actually that would be an excellent definition of hegemony itself. So, although Gramsci did not have access to Die Deutsche Ideologie, the German ideology, from where the above quote is taken, his familiarity with many other works by Marx led him to adopt such insights in his theoretical formations. Now, let me make it clear. Gramsci was exposed to some of the early manuscripts by Marx. So if you look at the critical edition of the Prison Notebooks, you look at the back, Valentino Gheratana gives you the whole list of texts to which Gramsci was exposed in prison. And you have the whole list of Marx and Engels' works, the Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, you know, the Holy Family, etc. Anyway, so although he had no access, but he was quite familiar with Marx's work, many of the early manuscripts. And why do I mention the early manuscripts? Of course, Gramsci obviously was also very much concerned with what was written in capital. But the early manuscript, because you have to keep this in mind, there's an idealistic streak, the Hegelian streak, which comes very strong in the early manuscripts, which would have appealed to somebody influenced by Benedetto Croce. Okay, so I think that's why I place a lot of emphasis on the early Marx here. So the above quote, the quote I gave you from Marx, illustrates a feature of hegemony, the term used by Lenin and others, and which also featured in the linguistics writings to which Gramsci, who studied the subject under Matteo Bartoli, had been exposed. Hegemony or hegemony, as many British people say, which is closer to the Greek origin actually, is not a word that Gramsci invented, by the way. As I said, Lenin used it before him, but it's a word which goes back to the Greeks. Hegemon, the general, okay? Hegemonia. Hegemony refers to a social situation in which, I love this quote from David Livingstone, all aspects of social reality are dominated by or supportive of a single class. Gramsci himself never gives a definition of hegemony. The worst thing you can do is try to look up a definition of hegemony in Gramsci. It's just all pervasive, but there's no specific definition. The emphasis here is on ruling by consent, and not simply through force. Now, this is also a bone of contention. I personally interpret it as being both consent and force. That's why I said not simply through force. Others don't see it that way. This involves a process of learning, since ogni rapporto di egemonia è necessariamente un rapporto pedagogico. Every relationship of hegemony is necessarily a pedagogical relationship. Education, in its wider context and conception, is therefore central to his particular formulation of hegemony. His entire political project is an educational project, and an expensive one at that. Civil society's ideological institutions, and now I will explain how he is using civil society, which is very different from the way it's being used today, such as law, education, mass media, and religion, engage in this educational relationship. Gramsci argues that in Western society, the state is surrounded and propped up by a network of these ideological institutions that constitute una robusta catena di fortezze e di casematte che si fa sentire quando c'è un tremolio dello Stato, a powerful system of fortresses and earthworks, which makes its presence felt whenever the state trembles. Education plays an important role in cementing the existing hegemony. It is crucial in securing consent for the ruling way of life. Gramsci, however, also suggests alternatives, which brings us, therefore, to the classical sociological distinction between structure or relationship between structure and agency. Now, this is a whittled down paper, so, you know, in the more fleshed out paper, which is going to be published in a journal called Educational Philosophy and Theory, there are less abrupt transitions. I had to cut down. Gramsci was no economic determinist. He was very anti-positivist. By the way, that also is a characteristic of the Italian cultural climate. Positivism is not very much accepted in Italy. Again, the influence of Benedetto Croce. That's one of the good things about the influence of Croce, in fact, and Gentile, and their idealism. He was very anti-positivist, a stance that is also reflected in his view of language and linguistics, and his criticism, following his mentor, Bartoli, of the neo-grammarians. His work, having a strong sense of agency, marked a decisive break with the official Marxism of the time. In one of his early pieces, and let's keep in mind that this was an early piece, so there's the mature Gramsci writing here, called La rivoluzione contro il capitale, referred to in English as Against Capital, the young Gramsci argued that the Bolshevik Revolution called into question the canons of historical materialism, a position from which he, Gramsci, would recoil in his more mature years, characterized by a deeper understanding of Marx's writings, where the canons of historical materialism are not so iron-like as the young Gramsci would have us believe. For Gramsci, there is a sense of agency also in his theoretical formulations concerning hegemony that has a number of features. Its non-static nature, it is constantly open to negotiation and renegotiation, its incompleteness, its selectivity, and its being marked by fissures. No, fissures, I don't know how to pronounce that. These allow spaces for counter-hegemonic activity. There are cracks within the system. The system is not monolithic. For Gramsci, the terrain wherein hegemony can be contested, confronted, is the very terrain supporting it, that of civil society, which is conceived of as a site of struggle. He argued that because he regarded the state as being propped up by the institutions of civil society, the state therefore cannot be confronted frontally by those aspiring to overthrow it in order to bring into place a new set of social relations, what he calls guerra manovrata frontale, war of maneuver. Now, why is he saying this? Because he was in prison and he was reflecting on the failure of the revolution in Turin, in Piedmont actually, when the workers thought that the revolution was going to happen in Turin, occupied the factories, but got no support from the rest of the island, from the rest of the peninsula. And that was actually crushed. They had to give up. Then you had the fascists take over, the famous march, so-called the myth of the march on Rome, etc. So people reflected. Gramsci starts reflecting, why isn't it possible to have a frontal attack as you would have had in Russia, where that was a frontal attack. I wonder whether he had any influence on the Red Brigades in his thinking, who thought they got to the heart of the state when they captured Moro. But anyway, so the process of transforming the state and its coercive apparatus must precede, through anticipatory work, the seizure of power. Although there's an important caveat here. So he says, you've got to do work before the state is transformed. However, non ci si può proporre, prima della conquista dello Stato, di modificare completamente la coscienza di tutta la classe operaia, sarebbe utopistico, perché la coscienza di tutta la classe come tale si modifica solo quando sia stato modificato il modo di vivere della classe stessa, cioè quando il proletariato sarà diventato classe dominante, avrà a sua disposizione l'apparato di produzione e di scambio e di potere statale. One cannot expect to modify the entire consciousness of the working class before the state is conquered. So you cannot have total ideological transformation before the state is conquered. That would be utopian, since the consciousness of the entire class can change only when that same class's way of life has changed. That is to say, when the proletariat, the working class, whatever, becomes the dominant class and has at its disposal the apparatus of production and exchange as well as state power. So basically what he's saying is, yes, you can surround the state, it's important to have work. There has to be a culture of a change in culture before the state is occupied, but that in itself has its limits, because ultimately the final push, the final change and transformation can only occur after one gains control over the apparatus of production and exchange, and therefore state power. Do you get that? All right. That's from a piece he wrote called Ideologica di Massa something. War of position. So while total ideological domination is not possible prior to the conquest of the state, there is much work, however, to be carried out beforehand to help generate the climate for change. This is not to say, therefore, that there should not be work beforehand. Ciò vuol dire che ogni rivoluzione è stata preceduta, we can use here the word rivoluzione or trasformazione today, preceduta da un intenso lavorio di critica, di penetrazione culturale, di permeazione di idee attraverso aggregati di uomini e donne, forse, prima refrattari e solo pensosi di risolvere giorno per giorno, ora per ora, il proprio problema economico e politico per se stessi, corporatism basically, senza legami di solidarietà con gli altri che si trovano nelle stesse condizioni, basically individualization. So, in English, every revolution has been preceded by an intense labor of criticism and by the diffusion of culture and the spread of ideas amongst masses of men who are at first resistant and think only of solving their own immediate economic and political problems for themselves, who have no ties of solidarity with others in the same condition. Gramsci affirms the importance of cultural activity. He wrote in Il Grido del Popolo, socialism is organization, and not only political and economic organization, but also organization of knowledge and of will, uptrained to cultural activity. So, this idea of having work, transformative work, taking place before the change in the political structure, brings to the forefront, therefore, the importance of ideas of cultural work, the importance of education, if you like, the importance of cultural studies, if you like. This kind of cultural work is important to bring about a transformation in society. Notice the break with the orthodox Marxist position, whereby these kind of ideas, this kind of work is, I don't know if you're familiar with this, is presented in a very crude way as epiphenomena, as something which is determined by the economic base. Only when the economic base is changed, then you can get the change in ideas. But Gramsci is saying no. There has to be a change in ideas beforehand because it creates the climate for change. Now, of course, there are always limits in the sense that we will not have a total ideological transformation. And by ideological, by the way, for those who are not familiar, I'm at the risk of now sounding patronizing, ideological in the sense used by Marx. He's talking about consciousness, okay? False consciousness, if you like, not as a system of ideas, but the idea of the obfuscation, mystification of the economic arrangements which have an effect then of how you make sense of the world. Did I get that correct? Anyway, I've tried. It's a very difficult thing to teach. I once was teaching and I mentioned the word the inculcation of ideology, and I said, how the hell am I going to explain ideology? And somebody raises her hand. This was a PGC class. That her English wasn't that good, but it actually was something to this effect. Never mind telling us about ideology. What do you mean by inculcation? And that made my day. And that made my day. Yes. Yeah, flabbergasted. Yes. People working for social transformation had to engage in a guerra di posizione, war of position, a process of wide-ranging social organization and cultural influence. This is what I was talking about. A process of wide-ranging social organization and cultural influence. It is through this process that the group creates whoever is trying to transform society. And I'm using the word group now, not just class, because this can apply to gender, it can apply to different groups. It could apply to gays and lesbians who want to bring about a transformation in society. So the cultural work is important, that the group creates, together with other groups and sectors of society, an alliance, an historical bloc, un blocco storico, which is a term that was borrowed from Georges Sorel. Now, this blocco storico is basically an alliance. You have to strike alliances, appeal to the interests of other groups to come together. Maybe it's like, on a global scale, it's like when we saw different social movements who have always been accused of being fragmentary, coming together in places like Seattle, because they see a common interest in trying to confront the World Trade Organization, to confront the G15 meetings. They find a common element, like a new historic bloc. Now, he was talking only at a national level, but today we have to transport this kind of thinking to a much more global level, because the situation has changed since 1936, 35, 33. So, you know. Now, back to the history. As a crucial area of civil society, the educational cultural formation of adults, for Gramsci, had an important role to play in this war of position. Both at the level of adult education within movements, in his case it was the working class movements and the peasant movements. Today, it's a much broader, we have a broader spectrum today, challenging the established state of affairs, these movements challenging the state of affairs, or at the level of individuals and enclaves operating in and against the state. Public employees, teachers in schools, who want to see a transformation in society, therefore, have to survive within the system, but at the same time work towards changing the system. Gramsci explored altre vie, other routes for education and learning. He saw progressive and emancipatory elements within these other routes, altre vie, that can complement the kind of Unitarian school he proposed when he wrote about the school in notebooks 4 and 12 of the prison notebooks to advance the interests of the Italian working class. That was his major concern. Now, these routes also included the Factory Council movement, basically an experiment in industrial democracy. That was, in effect, an adult education movement through which workers were educated, quote unquote, as producers rather than simply as salariati, wage earners, and initiated into the process of industrial democracy. We have the director of the Workers of the Center for Labour Studies here, promoting the idea of worker participation. This is of great relevance. For Gramsci, the factory councils were intended to provide the means whereby the working class could educate itself. Il Consiglio è il più idoneo organo di educazione reciproca e di sviluppo dello nuovo spirito sociale che il proletariato sia riuscito ad esprimere dall'esperienza viva e feconda della comunità di lavoro. The Council provides the ideal context for reciprocal education and for the development of the new social spirit which the proletariat managed to express as a result of its having been imbued with a rich experience deriving from the community of labor, from the labor process experienced community itself. So in other words, he saw the factories, he wasn't the only one, there was a whole movement behind this, as an important area to transform the relations of production, which are at the basis of other social relations in society. So this was to help the working class exercise, the idea was to help the working class exercise leadership before securing government power, by being able to transform relations of production. There was to be collaboration between all sectors so that in the production process, so that workers could experience l'unità di produzione and see themselves come parte indiscindibile di tutto il sistema di lavoro che si riassume nell'oggetto fabbricato. Therefore, the working class will see itself as an inseparable part of the whole labor system, which is concentrated in the object being manufactured. This is against the whole notion of alienation and the strange labor described by Marx, where you are just a partial operation in the system. So a good, sound education for greater worker control is to provide you with a broad spectrum of the entire production process, so that you will develop not just, there will be no separation between mental and labor. You will develop the mental control, because you have the sense of the larger picture. You are not just a partial operation in the system. Now, remember, in Marx, the whole idea of a strange labor, where you are just, because of now Taylorization, you are actually just a partial operation. You have no mental control. That's the divide between management and labor. They want to destroy that divide. This is a self-management and actually self-ownership as well, project that they had in mind. They would thus acquire mental control over the entire production process. Furthermore, the knowledge acquired at the workplace would, according to Gramsci, lead to a greater understanding of the workings of society. Allora, l'operaio è produttore perché ha acquistato coscienza della sua funzione nel processo produttivo in tutti i suoi gradi, alla fabbrica, alla nazione, al mondo. Because he's obviously seeing production at the basis of society in general. So transforming relations of production will eventually lead to transformation in society. Of course, as a Marxist, he puts the economy as the fundamental element in society. At this point, the worker has become a producer, for he, I put a sick in brackets, has acquired an awareness of his role in the process of production at all levels, from the workshop to the nation to the world. One assumes that the Factory Council's education must mirror the spirit of substantive democracy and collaboration, democracy in the industrial sense, industrial democracy I'm talking about, intended for the workplace and eventually the envisaged democratic worker state. For the environment generated by the Factory Councils was intended to anticipate that of the socialist state. So, for him, being a Marxist, he saw a transformation in relations of production as anticipating, actually, as being the harbinger, if you like, of the new state. Because what is the state? The state is not a thing. The different conceptions of the state in social theory, it's one of the most elusive concepts. But one of the most recurring, you'll find this in Marx, you'll find this in Gramsci, you'll find this in others, you see the work of Derek Sayer and Phil Corrigan, the Great Arch. The state as a relation, as a set of legitimized social relations. So if you are in a non-legitimate social relations, you are, in a way, operating on the margins of the state. So if you transform what are established relations, you transform that, you are also transforming the state as a social relation. Now, there's a whole debate on this, the whole idea of the social relation. There's a whole debate on this. So the state is not just a thing. It's a set of social relations which have to be transformed. I don't know how I can explain this more, but there's a huge debate about this. So it's a relational notion of the state we're dealing with here. The social state already exists potentially in the institutions of social life, characteristic of the exploited working class. To link these institutions, coordinating and ordering them into a highly centralized hierarchy of competence and powers, while respecting the necessary autonomy and articulation of each, is to create a genuine workers' democracy here and now. Now from this one can extrapolate that, you change social relations, you are changing the nature of the state itself. Because the state lends legitimacy and is to those social relations. Yet a war of position involved a cultural offensive on all fronts and was not to be restricted to the site of production. For Gramsci, different sites of learning. For Gramsci, different sites of social practice can be transformed into sites of adult learning. Gramsci comes across in his early writings as an indefatigable organizer and educator. When I say early writings, I'm talking about the period before he was arrested. The workplace educational experiences were to be sustained, according to Gramsci, by cultural centers and activities. One of these is the Club de Vita Morale, which he had organized in 1917, and wherein workers read works and gave presentations to each other. Another center was the short-lived Institute of Proletarian Culture, that drew inspiration from the Russian prolet cult. The proletarian culture, that is, Russian prolet cult. And the group associated with the French journal Clarté, that included Romain Rolland and Henri Barbusse. I don't know if you're familiar with Romain Rolland. He's the one who actually came out with the statement, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. People erroneously attribute that to Gramsci because Gramsci insisted that should be written in the Ordine Nuovo, which is the periodical, revolutionary periodical. That's actually Romain Rolland's phrase. Some of Gramsci's writings reveal a yearning on his part for the creation in Turin, of a cultural association for workers, one that offers space wherein workers can debate all that is of interest to the working class movement. Gramsci wrote that such an institution dovrebbe avere scopi di classe e limiti di classe, must have class aims and limits. It must be a proletarian institution seeking definite goals. He also felt that such an association would integrate political and economic activity with cultural activity. And reference is made in a piece in L'Ordine Nuovo, which was a periodical which gathered around it, at the time, before 1921, there was no Communist Party in Italy, but there was one large party, which was a catch-all party with different currents, which is the Italian Socialist Party, Partito Socialista Italiano. Different currents, ranging from Benito Mussolini, who was the editor of Avanti, for which Gramsci worked, to the most radical wing. Now, Gramsci pertained to the radical wing. The other guys who worked with Gramsci were Palmiro Togliatti and Umberto Terracini. But they also had links with people who were liberals, for example, like Piero Gobetti, who was eventually killed as a result of beatings by the squadristi fascisti, who's a brilliant intellectual, by the way. And, of course, people like Angelo Tasca, socialist, whose daughter actually, when he emigrated to France, became Minister of Culture in France in the year 2000. Angelo Tasca. Now, three of them, Terracini, Togliatti, and Gramsci, created this very revolutionary banner, which was a newspaper, which was the forefront of the radical group, which eventually would be the splinter group which would create the Communist Party, L'Ordine Nuovo. In fact, L'Ordine Nuovo, those of you who are not familiar, I know it's a mixed group here in terms of the knowledge of Gramsci, has become now almost like, how shall I say, you want to talk about something radical, we're going to have another Ordine Nuovo. Ordine Nuovo became synonymous with radicalism. So, it was very revolutionary in that respect. So, in a piece written in L'Ordine Nuovo, he refers to the first experiences of a proletarian school. Now, he romanticizes it. Gramsci glorifies this institute. This is my reading of what he wrote. And its participants, extolling the latter's determination workers, despite their tiredness after a day's work, to learn, not simply to advance personally, as with bourgeois schools, but to realize their dream of a better society. I wonder whether that was just wishful thinking on his part, but anyway, you see what you want to see, right? But that's what he writes. I find he overglorifies it. Gramsci had from the beginning recognized the importance of learning centers. In 1916, for instance, Gramsci had delivered talks to workers, study circles in Torino on a variety of topics. So the reason why I'm mentioning Gramsci in this context is that Gramsci was not just a theorist, a social theorist, a grand theorist. He was. But he was also an educator himself. He dedicated a lot of time to educating others, even at the expense of never having finished his formal university education because of his weaknesses, his illness. You know, he had what is now diagnosed as Pott's disease, etc. Despite the fact he was a brilliant student and wrote brilliant papers on linguistics and philology, I mean. The prison school, for example. The ongoing commitment by Gramsci to explore opportunities for proletarian adult education continued also after his incarceration, and is reflected in his efforts, despite obvious physical and external constraints, to help create a Scuola dei Confinati, a prison school, at Ustica, the prison island. When the fascists rounded up most of the people they considered subversive, Gramsci being one of them, they sent them over to Ustica before they had to face trial. It was a tortuous journey for Gramsci. He was put on a cart. The guy was disabled. So Gramsci is also a role model for disabled people in this respect. And, you know, like, they had to travel half the length of the peninsula, etc. And then, you know, there was stop-starts from Palermo to cross over to Ustica, etc. And this was an island where it actually was a prison. You could actually roam around the island. That's the sense I get from what I read, from the letters. At the school, different courses leading to different studies of levels of study were held. In a 1927 letter to Piero Sraffa was a great friend of Gramsci. He was a professor of economics at the University of Cagliari and eventually ended up at the University of Cambridge. And he actually opened an account in a Milan bookstore for books to be sent over to Gramsci when he was given permission to read and write. Gramsci indicates the different grades into which the school was organized, catering for people of different backgrounds, some of whom were semi-literate, even though Gramsci pointed out that they were intellectually well developed. He never associated illiteracy with intellectual ability, which is a mistake we still do today, in our schools especially. There were 2 courses in French, lower and superior, and the course in German. Gramsci studied German, Russian, economics and history. He probably studied some of these subjects on his own, thanks also to the books procured on his behalf from a Milan bookstore by his good friend Piero Sraffa. Now, what type of educator did Gramsci have in mind, especially amongst adults? Does agency lie with a potential target learning group? Adult educators engaging in counter-hegemonic cultural activity within the above-mentioned structures that I mentioned could be considered as organic intellectuals, that is, cultural educational workers who are experts in legitimation. They are organic to the subordinate groups aspiring to power. This implies that they should be politically committed to those they teach. Unless this occurs, there can be no effective learning, unless there's commitment. One had to avoid emulating the adult education centers that were popular in Italy at the time, known as the popular universities, dove si bada più alla lustra che alla efficacia, says Gramsci. More care was taken in these schools to impress than to teach effectively, in un processo nel quale si distribuiscono delle sporte di viveri, in a process whereby backfuls of victuals were distributed. Gramsci argued that the working class should produce its own intellectuals or else assimilate traditional intellectuals. The educational needs of the industrial working class. Well, it was, for Gramsci, Gramsci was very much a strict Marxist in this sense. It was to the industrial proletariat, located in Torino, that Gramsci looked for revolutionary potential. This is a very contentious issue, about strategies for transformation. Although he attempted to deal at some depth with la questione meridionale, the southern question, and I used questione the way Gramsci writes it. Today it's questione, but that was archaic Italian, and advocated an historical bloc characterized by a national popular alliance between the working class in the north and the peasantry, because most of the working class in the north were the sons of immigrants from the south. In fact, there was a link between the two. He ascribed to the former, the working class in the north, the role of leadership in the alliance, e tuttavia noi eravamo per la formula molto realistica e per nulla magica della terra ai contadini, ma volevamo che essa fosse inquadrata in un'azione rivoluzionaria generale delle due classi alleate, sotto la direzione del proletariato industriale. We favor the very realistic and not at all magic formula of the land for the peasants, but we wanted it to be realized inside the framework of the general revolutionary action of the two allied classes under the leadership of the industrial proletariat. That is from the Southern Question, La Questione Meridionale. Most of Gramsci's writings relevant to adult education focus on the educational needs of the industrial working class. Adult literacy, an important concern for anyone dealing with adult education in the southern Italian regions, or all education for that matter, where illiteracy was widespread, up to 70, even 90% in certain regions, is given lip service in Gramsci's writings. There is a very short piece explaining the causes of peasant class resistance to compulsory education. In short, Gramsci identifies a specific adult education clientele, the revolutionary agent, if you like, and this exposed him to the criticism of being essentialist. A la Laclau and Mouffe. They actually accused him of doing that. Pedagogy. That Gramsci was concerned with mitigating hierarchical relations between those who educate and direct, and those who learn, can be seen from his writings concerning philosophy, language, culture, and hegemony relations. Echoing Marx's third thesis on Feuerbach, the educator must himself be educated, he advocates un rapporto attivo di relazioni reciproche, dove ogni maestro è sempre scolaro e ogni scolaro maestro, a relationship that has to be active and reciprocal, one whereby every teacher is always a pupil and every pupil a teacher. The same applies to his views concerning educators. Now, in his note on the Unitarian School, which is Notebook 4 and Notebook 12, basically in the prison notebooks, in Notebook 12, he revisits what he wrote in Notebook 4 and makes some slight suggestions, so you've got a repetition. He talks about schooling. Now, in his, what he calls La Scuola Unitaria, often translated by Quentin Horan Noel Smith as the common school. In that note, Gramsci refers to teachers who limit themselves to a straightforward transmission of facts as mediocre. Okay? This, for me, is where Harold Van Twissel got it wrong in his reading of Gramsci. These teachers are closely associated with the old school, the old classical school that the Gentile reform, the reform introduced by the fascist Minister of Education, the idealist philosopher Giovanni Gentile, when he made the separation between vocational schools and the classical schools, that he put an end to the old system where you had the old schools, where there was a lot of emphasis on humanistic education, the kind of school from which Gramsci emerged. So these teachers are closely associated with the old school, that, though having its merits, was considered wayward enough by Gramsci to justify a struggle for its replacement. And I have a quote from Gramsci himself there, 1975-499. He actually says it has to change. In fact, as Mario Alighiero Manacorda, one of the most prominent writers in Italy, you've probably read his stuff when you did your dissertation, writing about education and Gramsci, one of the first, in fact, what he states is, as he states, the writing on the Unitarian school, highlighting the virtues of the old humanistic school, is an epitaph to the school. It laments the passing of the school that cannot continue to serve its purpose any longer since the social reality has changed. The problem for Gramsci, however, is that the new system introduced as its replacement to the Riforma Gentile is a retrograde one, falling far short of his ideal of a fusion between the academic and the technical, because in his conception of what the school should be like, which he considers a boarding school because working class students have to bridge the cultural capital divide, he talks about, at a later stage, the technical doesn't have to be, technical doesn't mean geared towards a job. Gramsci was against that. He actually says one should not mortgage, hypothecare, the future of the child. Okay? But the technical and the academic have to come together, which has been, actually, Gramsci anticipated, a lot of people have written this, and they've used Gramsci, but it never happens. But the thing is, it's always one of the major critiques. In fact, Ronald Sultan, in his book, Education and National Development, makes the same proposal, if I'm not mistaken. So Gramsci highlighted the merits of conveying facts, an aspect of the old school, in reaction to what he perceived to have been the emerging practice at the time of carrying out dialogue in a vacuum. He saw this as a distortion of Dewey's principles under the Gentile reforms. The implication for educators and adult educators seems to be that a certain degree of instruction needs to be imparted to render any dialogical education an informed one. The pedagogy is directive, it is intended towards a political goal, striking a balance between spontaneità e direzione consapevole, striking a balance between spontaneity and conscious direction. One other aspect, the cultural dimension of workers' education. What constitutes really useful knowledge in this context? Quite often, we come across workers' education programs. Now I'm moving from the school to workers' education programs. As I said, I had to cut down. Quite often, we come across workers' education programs that are restricted to production issues, labor studies. Gramsci advocated a broader education, focusing on both aspects of very problematic terms, these are high and low cultural divide. Basically, I put them in single quotation marks, because the relations between the two are much stronger than one gains the impression that they are. Referring to the traditional school, Gramsci argues that pupils learn Greek and Latin for no immediate practical reasons, but si imparano per conoscere la civiltà dei due popoli, la cui vita si pone come base della classe mondiale. To know, we learn Greek and Latin, to know at first hand the civilization of Greece and Rome, a civilization that was a necessary precondition for our modern civilization. Cioè, per essere se stessi e conoscere se stessi consapevolmente. In other words, get to know the past, to know yourself. They learn them to be themselves and know themselves consciously. This is what Gramsci wrote. Gramsci considers several elements of the canon to be relevant to the working class needs. For instance, he seems to have seen in Ibsen's Nora Helmer, the protagonist in The Doll's House, to see in her elements for formazione di una nuova personalità femminile, the basis for the new feminine personality, very much a Shavian interpretation of Ibsen, Bernard Shaw that is, about which he writes in his notes on Americanism and Fordism. Such knowledge, however, should not be treated unproblematically. The process involved is one of critical appropriation. Creare una nuova cultura non significa solo fare individualmente delle scoperte originali, significa anche e specialmente diffondere criticamente delle verità già scoperte, socializzarle per così dire, e pertanto farle diventare base di azioni vitali, elemento di coordinamento e di ordine intellettuale e morale. Creating a new culture does not only mean one's own individual original discoveries, it also and most particularly means the diffusion in a critical form of truths already discovered, their socialization as it were, and even making them the basis of vital action, an element of coordination and intellectual and moral order. Right. Now, we cannot talk about the high-low cultural divide without talking about what lies at the heart of Gramsci's philosophy, which is the philosophy of praxis. Now, the philosophy of praxis, people say he used the term as to cover up, sort of as reference to Marxism, but it is more than that. It is at the heart of his philosophy. The philosophy of praxis was central to Gramsci's work, spanning across the quaderni. Gramsci contrasts his overarching philosophy, the philosophy of praxis, based on action and reflection, with common sense, quote unquote. Now, he's not using common sense the way we use it popularly. Gramsci saw ideas that reflect the dominant material relationships as residing in common sense, which contains elements of good sense, but which is in effect a distorted and fragmentary conception of the world. La filosofia dei non filosofi. Now, there's an element of elitism here in Gramsci, yeah? And many people have leveled this kind of criticism. The philosophy of non-philosophers. The challenge for Gramsci is to supersede this common sense to a philosophy of praxis, making it more coherent and less contradictory. that would undergo a process of elaboration similar to that experienced by Lutheranism and Calvinism before developing into a superior culture. So in other words, the thinking goes through various phases, okay, reaching a mature phase. Now, this is, of course, is the kind of thing which opened Gramsci to criticism of being very elitist in his own approach to knowledge and philosophy. Then we have to talk also about the philosophy of praxis and the relationship between education and production, because often praxis is also used in the restricted sense also. There's the broader sense of praxis, reflecting on your life, but also reflection, mental control over your labor. And the notion of praxis often characterizes this fusion between education and production, as manifest in the factory council theory. Now that was a classic theme in Marxist writing, starting with Marx himself, as I will show. It is for this reason that Gramsci revealed a fascination for forms of art that stressed the relationship between human beings and industry, as in his initial, albeit short-lived, fascination for the futurist movement. And it is this preoccupation that led Gramsci to affirm somewhat idealistically the virtues of what Marx regarded as a polytechnical education, arguing for a strong relationship to be forged between education and production, a notion which Marx had specifically developed in the Geneva Resolution of 1866. The combination of workplace economic and administrative learning to such institutions as the factory councils with the development of cultural awareness were intended towards this goal. Two final themes. The theme of language. We cannot leave this out, because Gramsci, as I said, had great interest in language and maintained that interest, not just as a student, but even his writings, even in prison. And finally, the question of the South, migration, and multi-ethnic education, probably the most relevant part. The issue of mastering the dominant culture in order to transform it is also developed in other aspects of Gramsci's work. So earlier on I spoke about the relationship between high and low culture, quote unquote. As I said, these are very artificial separations. Now this also applies, the same kind of thinking applies to language. For instance, Gramsci advocates mastery of the dominant language for members of the subaltern classes not to remain on the periphery of political life. This would be very relevant to Malta vis-à-vis Maltese and English. This does not mean that he endorsed the hegemony of this language, which is the Tuscan dialect so strongly favored by Manzoni, which became the national language. It constituted, after all, the dominant dialect, the Tuscan dialect, the hegemony of the Tuscan dialect, constituted, after all, a form of passive revolution, which is a revolution not rooted in popular consciousness, but imposed from above. That's a passive, like for example, Ataturk in Turkey, right? He imposed doing away with the Muslim state. He imposed that. Now that doesn't last long, because it does not have its roots in popular consciousness. Now for Gramsci, this is fundamental for the concept of hegemony. To have a transformation in the hegemonic relationship, you have to be rooted at the level of popular consciousness. Unless you do that, this will not happen. This is why Protestantism was successful, because it had its roots in popular consciousness. For him, that was the last great big revolution, intellectual and moral reform, which took place in Europe. And for him to bring about a transformation, to have a transformation in society, which will therefore do away with the class structure, you need that kind of reformation, rooted in popular consciousness. It does not happen by a frontal attack. Okay? So, the same applies to language. The problem with Gramsci is there was no national popular language in Italy. Now, a lot has been written on this. Peter Ives is one of the best writers on the subject. He's a political theorist, but very much into linguistics. Italian, what today is considered to be formal Italian, is an imposition of a dialect. It is a form of passive revolution. It was imposed from above, favored by people like Manzoni himself, who apparently was not just a writer, but was very, very influential in promoting this. It constituted, after all, a form of passive revolution and did not connect with the various languages of subaltern groups that, as with all languages, reflect specific conceptions of the world. So every language call it dialect, whatever. Every language reflects a conception of the world. The national language was not a national popular language because it in no way reflected the sum total, if you like, of all the various languages in Italy. I shudder to think how it could be different, but anyway. This has implications for adult literacy programs, for instance. Gramsci believed in the importance of a national standard language. He did. But he favored a process of linguistic hegemony characterized by the presence of a normative grammar that derived from the interactions of the spontaneous grammars found in the peninsula's different regions. So in every different region you have spontaneous grammars. He sees the national normative grammar, taken for granted as a norm now, has to, in a way, be a reflection of these different spontaneous grammars. A national popular standard language, if you will, which would be more democratic in that it would reflect the collective will. Now, I don't know how that can come about, but anyway, that's his theoretical reaction to the way formal Italian was imposed. And organic intellectuals had an important role to play in elaborating and creating connections between these spontaneous grammars, something which was not occurring in Gramsci's time, since those people with potential for intellectual leadership, this is very important for Gramsci, among the subaltern classes, those who had the potential to provide intellectual leadership, were co-opted, partly through their being equipped with a normative grammar that was alien to the subordinated classes. They speak a language that subordinated classes don't speak. This normative grammar, therefore, served to alienate potential organic intellectuals from these subaltern classes, rendering them traditional intellectuals instead. Intellectuals, that is, traditional intellectuals, whose activity deceptively appeared to be devoid of any social moorings. They appear to be socially unattached, when in actual fact, this activity served to consolidate the hegemony of the dominant groups. What he's saying is the traditional intellectual appears to be socially neutral, but in actual fact, he's very much socially compromised. Okay, and he accuses actually Benedetto Croce and Giustino Fortunato as being two very responsible people in this regard. In the short piece dealing with illiteracy, referred to earlier, he emphasized the need for peasants to learn a standard language to transcend their insular environment characterized by campanilismo. Moreover, he also felt, I'm going to clip that quote, that the proletariat would achieve greater unity through the ability to speak one common language, although he refutes the idea that Esperanto can constitute such a language. This unity would not be achieved if various regional groups within the subaltern classes confine themselves to merely speaking their own particular dialect. But there's a lot of work which has to happen to create a national popular language out of these different regional languages. Now, the final section. This is inspired by an interrupted manuscript by Gramsci called La Questione Meridionale. Gramsci was in Rome. He arrived in Rome on the eve of Giacomo Matteotti's assassination. He was in exile. He was in Vienna before that. The fascists were in power. So he was working in the place he was renting on a manuscript because he was fascinated, being from the south, from Sardinia, fascinated. He was all intrigued by the whole issue of the south, the Meridione. I have to admit that this is the part of Gramsci which really attracted me to his work, because I found myself in this, coming from Malta, etc. I think this is very relevant to people like us. And I find this to be the piece I want to work on, because there's not much written from an educator's perspective. The education implications of the Southern question. What does this mean for a pedagogy of the South? What does it mean for education in the South? What does it mean for education in countries traditionally considered to be peripheral? There is much in Gramsci's work that can be of relevance to the process of adult education for multi-ethnic solidarity in an age of globalization characterized by mobility of capital and labor across borders, certainly not on an equal footing. The concept of nazionale popolare, so much emphasized by Gramsci, I just mentioned language earlier on, looking for a national popular language, national popular state. The concept of nazionale popolare takes on a specific meaning in this context. What is national is often tied to the culture of hegemonic ethnic groups, and is related to the whole structure of hegemony. So when we start talking about national identity, etc., be careful. We have to be careful. Concepts such as national identity, national culture are thus challenged as part of the process of negotiating relations of hegemony in societies that are constantly becoming multi-ethnic. A progressive adult education project on Gramscian lines would contribute to this contestation. As Pasquale Verdicchio argues in an essay on the Southern question, the questione meridionale extends beyond Italy to the presence elsewhere of the southern Italian migrant diaspora. One can apply this consideration to the South at large, to indicate how the question of the southern populations extends beyond this part of the world to the presence elsewhere of the southern diaspora. Taking liberties with a statement by Verdicchio, I would say that the southern emigrant is a decontextualized expression of the contradictory process of state formation in the country of origin. Actually, it's the disposable human beings which result as a result of the construction of that particular state in the country of origin. One of the challenges for critical adult education work with migrants, therefore, is that of enabling the migrants to read not only the world they now inhabit as immigrants, but also the world they left. The same would apply to critical educators engaged in receiving countries working with migrants from the world's southern regions. In this respect, there is relevance for the current situation in Gramsci's insistence that the Turin communists in the north of Italy at his time, which largely included people of southern origin, brought the southern question to the attention of the workers' vanguard, identifying it as one of the key issues for the working class proletariat's national politics. The southern question takes on a larger meaning and significance in this day and age. Furthermore, the National Popular Alliance of Italian Workers and Peasants, advocated by Gramsci, he always spoke about the alliance between workers and peasants, takes on a larger, more global north-south meaning in this age of mass migration from the south to the north. Adult education and other programs of a truly international socialist kind must constantly foreground the issue of the south in the interest of generating north-south solidarity and confronting misplaced alliances. This includes the false alliance between labor and management against the competition. Misplaced alliance is therefore based on racist labor market segmentation strategies. Such an anti-racist program of adult education, allied to strong social action, can only be successful if rooted in political economy and an understanding of colonialism. These are the elements that Gramsci sought to bring to his analysis of the southern question in Italy, placing the emphasis on political economy and the historical understanding of Italy's internal colonialism, north-south. The Risorgimento represented, in fact, a state of internal colonialism. The southern question becomes an important challenge for adult educators intending to draw insights from Gramsci in an age characterized by the intensification of the mass mobility of labor power from south to north. The interrupted essay by Gramsci in question adds to the insights that radical adult educators and critical educators in general derive from such other pertinent writings by Gramsci, such as those on the factory councils, the prison schools, socialist culture, the ceti intellettuali, intellectual strata that is, and the Unitarian school. These writings have turned Gramsci into a veritable icon for radical adult educators in many parts of the world. Thank you.